Hi everyone, welcome to Chapter 4, which is our first region for the course, which is Europe. Chapter 4 will be divided into 4 parts. We're going to do 3 parts in this module, and then in the next module, we're going to do the last part, and you're going to have your first exam. Your first exam will be on everything through Europe. So you're going to learn about learning about Europe in the next module and take an exam on that region as well as the previous modules. Europe is by far the most developed and wealthiest region that we're going to look at in this class, and in the world for that matter. This is a picture of Rovinj, Croatia, that I took several years ago. And so we're going to talk about everything from the physical geography, which we'll do first, to language and religion, economics, urbanization, demographics, political geography. And so the format for this region will follow very closely with the format that we do for other regions. And so you're going to want to be following along in your textbook, reading through chapter 4 as you go through these lectures. And so the question is like, what do we mean by Europe? Because Europe is not really a continent. You can see Europe is well attached to Asia. So it is part of Eurasia. Europe is considered everything west of the Ural and north of the Caucasus Mountains. So basically, everything to the north and west of that red line is considered part of Europe. And you can see that Russia is even included in there, while Russia is its own region for this class. Not all of geographic Europe is included in this region. This region is made up because of cultural, economic distinctions that make it a region. And so, again, I showed you this map before, but this is a map of Europe, and it obviously says what's in Europe, but it also says what is considered not to be in Europe. And so there are certainly some people who would disagree with this map about what belongs and what does not belong in Europe, especially Turkey, while not traditionally considered part of Europe. The western portion of Turkey is very European and has applied to enter the EU several times. So first we're going to talk about the physical geography of Europe in this part. Europe is basically a giant peninsula of peninsulas, right? So it's surrounded on water on 3 sides, so it's this really large peninsula, and then it just has all of these smaller peninsulas off of it. It has over 20,000 miles of coastline, which is incredible given its size. Africa, which is much, much larger, only has about 16,000 miles of coastline. It has a mountainous region to the south, um, which includes not just the Alps, but some other mountains as well. Plains in the north, which are very good for agriculture. And it has many navigable rivers. And this really gave Europe an upper hand in kind of being able to explore the world and ship goods throughout the region and throughout the world. It has a very accessible interior due to these many navigable rivers. And so when we talk about Africa, we're going to talk about the fact that it has a much shorter coastline. Its rivers generally are not navigable, which means you can't bring ships up them. They're very shallow and have lots of waterfalls. And so the interior of Africa was not very accessible as opposed to the interior of Europe, which was. So the mountains to the south are from tectonic activity. Basically, you get this crust folding together that is pushing up this mountain range. You have the African plate that is subducting or going underneath that European plate. And you can see here a picture of the real Matterhorn on the Swiss-Italian border, which the one in Disney World is modeled after. And because there's a lot of mountains, you get a lot of rivers, right? That act of precipitation falling and that water going downhill creates all of these rivers. And so that's another way it differs from other regions, such as Africa, that do not have a bunch of tectonic activity and do not have a lot of mountains. So again, we see here our map of plate tectonics, and we can see the African plate is being pushed underneath the Eurasian plate and causing mountains to rise up there. We have volcanic activity in southern Europe due to a subduction zone that's happening under the Mediterranean. So we have active volcanoes you can see here, like Mount Etna in Sicily, um, Santorini in Greece. So again, active volcanoes in Italy and in Greece. Volcanic soil is very, very fertile. So you get a lot of agriculture that's happening there. It's full of minerals that plants need. Um, and this is kind of counteracted by that dry climate. So even though you're not getting a ton of precipitation in the south, you can still kind of grow some really wonderful things just because you have this very, very fertile soil. Most of the mountains in Europe, such as the Alps, are not active volcanoes. So it's really, you have that active volcano just happening right in southern Europe, Greece, Italy, that region. And so again, when we're talking about volcanic activity, what's happening here is you have this this plate pushing underneath this other plate. You get these little breaks that pop up, then this pressure, you get a magma chamber, and then you wind up with volcanoes in a volcanic arc. The northern plains, there's no tectonic activity. Think about our kind of Midwest plains. They have recently been glaciated, much like our Midwest plains. And so, not that long ago, geologically speaking, they were covered with ice. They have really good soil for farming. It's called loess. And the rivers flow from the mountains in the south out to the North Sea and the English Channel. And all of these rivers can be used for irrigation for agriculture, right? So even if they're not getting a ton of precipitation there, which they definitely get much more than the South, you're able to kind of really do industrial type agriculture because you have this steady source of water coming from these mountains. And again, you can ship your goods easily throughout the rest of Europe or even to the world because you have these rivers that go so far inland that you could bring ships and goods on. So we see here the port of Duisburg, right, which is in Germany, is very, very far inland. And this looks like a coastal port, right? We have lots of shipping containers. Big ships are able to get up these rivers to reach the interior. And so compared to North America, Europe is at a similar latitude for parts of it. So we have a lot of very similar climate types. It's a smaller area than North America, but it has a much longer coastline. So again, you can see the coastline of Europe is just, we have all of these ins and outs and little peninsulas. So lots and lots of coastline, which gives them that advantage. It's at a high latitude, right? So we in San Diego have a Mediterranean climate in the south, which kind of mimics this Mediterranean climate in southern Europe as well. It's named after that. Mostly temperate climate, right? Easy to live in, very habitable. And part of that is due to the Gulf Stream, which this warm ocean current, which I'll show you in a second, that keeps the weather of the region very, very mild. So here you can see the Gulf Stream, excuse me, is bringing warm water up from the equator, up past Ireland and the UK. And this is one of the reasons why it tempers that weather. So you would expect here is Ireland and the UK, right, at a similar latitude. It's much, much colder here in Canada, but you get this very nice warm water that's coming up that keeps it very, very mild and keeps it from being as cold. So because of this humidity, air and warm water, you can get palm trees in Scotland, in Plockton, Scotland, excuse me, which is the same latitude as Juneau, Alaska. Palm trees are not native to this area of Scotland, but it does not freeze there, and so they're able to live because of that temperate climate. It's certainly not warm, warm there, but it is not freezing there. So I'm just going to go through some of the European climate types and kind of what the weather is like there. So again, it's temperate. It's not too cold. It's not too hot, with the exception of Iceland and the subarctic and tundra, which is a little colder. So we get this very wet to semi-arid landscape. There are no deserts in Europe. And the first climate we're going to talk about is the marine west coast, which you can see here in England. It's like the Pacific Northwest, right? Very, very rainy. Humid continental, which is like the Midwest and the East Coast of the United States, very similar weather. The Mediterranean areas, which are in Spain, the south of France, Italy, Greece, Croatia, and that's like Southern California. That's the same type of climate type we have here in Southern California. So dry summers, very, very mild winters, not a huge temperature range. Generally speaking, you're going to get your rain in the winter. And something else that I wanted to talk about, touch upon briefly, as far as kind of not really related to the physical geography, but kind of the environment of Europe. Europe uh, produces much more no carbon electricity, so burns a lot less fossil fuels than the United States does. Many countries, including Iceland, Switzerland, Norway, Sweden, France, they are releasing way less emissions. And so if you look at the United States here, this is our no carbon electricity generation, and we do it. About 20% of our electricity is generated from nuclear. Then we have high dams or hydrologic power, and then we have a little bit of wind power, some solar that's making a bit of a gain, and some burning of biomass and waste. And so, if you look at Iceland, Iceland has a ton of electricity generated by geothermal, which you can't do everywhere. France has almost entirely 80% of its electricity generated by nuclear power. So part of what you're going to do next is you're going to go back and you're going to that discussion board on the Paris Climate Accord, and I want you to talk about it a little more, but you're going to post on somebody else's discussion board. I want you to specifically now go and do a little reading on the views of the climate accord in Europe itself, especially because if we see, you know, a place like France, between 80 to 100% of its electricity does not have any carbon emissions. So I want you to comment on somebody else's post. About whether or not you agree or disagree with what they wrote. There'll be instructions there for the discussion board. And remember, you have to be specific. I don't want just a little like, I agree, I don't agree. So you're going to go complete that next before you move on to the next part of chapter 4.